2022 de las conferencias con los expertos mundiales de ELA, con los líderes mundiales en investigación de la esclerosis lateral amiotrófica. En esta oportunidad, y teniendo en cuenta todos los ensayos que tenemos en fase 3, vamos a empezar con el estudio recientemente terminado del Edaravone oral para los pacientes con ELA, junto con una de sus principales investigadoras, Terry Heyman Patterson. Y asimismo también nos va a ilustrar acerca de noticias conmovedoras en este primer inicio del 2022, donde por primera vez un paciente con ELA pudo expresarse a través de una interfase cerebro-computadora, a través de un chip que se coloca en el cerebro. Y por supuesto también en su expertise que tiene que ver con la investigación genética en la ELA. Así que espero que podamos de alguna manera informarnos, asesorarnos, estar al tanto de todas las novedades de investigación y en este caso dándole la bienvenida a Terry Heyman Patterson a nuestra primer aula virtual del 2022.
Thank everyone for the invitation to speak. I love to speak to pals and educate them. I think it's really important to be educated about your disease and about what's going on. Information is really valuable and knowledge is golden. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm always open to contacting me for additional information. But today I'm going to be talking about the genetics of ALS and how that's led to treatments for ALS, and specifically focus on Edaravone, and then talk about something I think is really important, which is leveraging technology that we have available today to enable folks with ALS and specifically BCI. But I'm going to give a little overview about assistive technologies. So, so to begin with the genetics, 10% of ALS is familial. It runs in families. The first identified gene was back in 1993, and it was that SOD1 that everybody's heard about. And it turns out that approximately 20% of families that have ALS running in them carry this gene for the copper zinc superoxide dismutase. And we've now identified more than 187 ways that that gene can be damaged and cause disease. And it turns out that this disease is a gain in function and causes extra oxidative stress in the cell. It also accounts for 1 to 2% of people who have no family history, what we call sporadic ALS. And it really provided the first genetic models of ALS for us to study the disease. And the families who were affected showed us about complexity of the disease, because in fact, within a family, two people could carry the same mutation, the same damage to that gene, but yet have a different expression, have a different age of onset, different severity, different progression. And that made us understand that there must be other things going on, what we call genetic modifiers that alter the way the disease looked. In addition, it might be that there were different exposures that altered the way the disease looked in different family members. And understanding that would also tell us something about the disease. And now we have more than 40 different genes which have been implicated that account for more than 70% of the families in which ALS runs. And if you look at this graph, what you can see is that, in fact, over time, there's been, and if you can see my pointer, an acceleration of our ability to detect genes that are involved. And this has really been made possible by advances in our technology. You know, it was very slow initially down here when we first discovered SOD back in the 90s. We did linkage, what we call genetic linkage and positional cloning, and it took a lot of time. But then we sequenced the whole human genome, and that really allowed us to increase the speed with which we could sequence a genome, and the cost was lowered, and we were able to use genome-wide association studies, whole genome sequencing, whole exome sequencing, ways to really look at genes in ALS populations and sequence what they look like and find these mutations. And finally, improve statistical techniques. And that's really enabled us to identify in an accelerated way all of these genes. And then the final and most important area was collaboration. We really learned to collaborate with each other across countries and continents to find all of these and identify all of these. And at this point, if you look at these genes and the populations, you can see here our familial ALS. We've actually, in about 70% of familial cases, we can identify a gene, and you can see kind of the path to that. But also, I think it's really important to understand that even in people with ALS who don't have a family history, upwards of, well, some populations, 11 to 15% to be specific, we can find some of these genetic abnormalities also in those populations. And, you know, this really means that, and my belief is that really all of ALS, there's a genetic influence, if you will. We're all destined to get something, right? And in the case of ALS, our genetic endowment makes us susceptible, I suspect. And this graphic shows you over here, these diagrams, these circular diagrams show you the percentage of cases, or the percentage of PALs that each gene is implicated in. So in the case of familial ALS, by far and away, that abnormal repetitive gene in C9 makes up 40% of familial cases. And even in sporadic, no family history, it's anywhere between 4 and 7%, depending on your population. Different populations have different frequencies, if you will. And so if we were to create or learn a treatment strategy for C9orf72, for that increased piece of DNA that's inserted in that gene that causes disease, we could, in one fell swoop, really treat 40% of familial, which is 4% of all ALS, and then another 4 to 7% of sporadic, which means upwards of 10% or more of people with ALS could be treated with a real intangible treatment. I think that's exciting. But even more exciting about the genetics is I'll get to in a moment after I talk a little bit about FTD. But what I'm going to get to is the fact that these genes have identified pathways and mechanisms of disease that overlap with what we know about sporadic disease. But I wanted to also comment on the fact that some of these genes overlap and can cause either frontotemporal dementia or ALS. And this tells you that there's shared genetics between the dementias and ALS. And also there are shared pathologies in that in both FTD and ALS, there can be protein aggregation. And so this overlap tells us that this is really a continuum. Neurodegenerative diseases are a continuum. They share genetic abnormalities and they share pathologies. And it tells us that there's only certain ways that neurons can react to an insult. And depending on your genetic makeup, the population of neurons that are affected will manifest as a disease like dementia or ALS or even Parkinson's, which is our third neurodegenerative disease. So this continuum means that solving any of these neurodegenerative diseases may lead to insights into the others. So it's important for all of these to be studied. And then, as I was promising, these genetic abnormalities have led to an increased understanding of what pathways can be involved in ALS. This is a busy slide, but it's only meant to show you those 10 pathways that are implicated by the genetic abnormalities. And these same pathways, even before we knew these genes had been implicated, were identified in sporadic ALS. These are pathways that we've talked about for a long time in ALS, and they're validated by the genetic changes that lead to ALS. And in fact, two of them are really important because they've resulted in drugs that have slowed the disease down, and that's excitotoxicity, which is that glutamate excitotoxicity. Remember that glutamate is an amino acid that's needed for nerve cells to talk to each other. And if you look over here, I hope you can see my arrow. You know, glutamate is needed for good communication, but if there's too much of it, that leads to nerve degeneration, to nerves being damaged. Riluzole, and we'll talk about that in a moment, one of the drugs that has slowed the disease down reduces that amount of glutamate in the in this junction between nerve cells and reduces excitotoxicity and slows disease down. In addition, mitochondrial function and oxidative stress is another pathway that, when targeted by Edaravone, has led to slowing the disease down, and certainly has been implicated both in sporadic and genetic ALS. So these genetic mutations that have implicated pathways that we know to be important even through sporadic ALS studies as well as genetic studies, and these are targeted pathways that we can use to target treatments that may modify the disease. And in fact, I know that you have had several discussions about the pipeline, so to speak, and this shows you that all of these pathways are being targeted. And we have in red, you see the drugs that have actually shown an effect on disease. The green shows you some of those drugs in the pipeline in that platform trial that I'm sure you've read about. And of course, the AMX0035 drug from Amylyx, which everybody's very excited about, has had a successful phase 2, and we're hoping it's in phase 3 now, and we're hoping it'll show an effect. But I just wanted to highlight how knowing the pathway gives us targets. And now more than ever, when I started, look, I've been around for 40 years doing ALS since 1982. And when I started, there was not even a clinical trial. There was certainly no drugs. And to see this kind of pipeline, this kind of interest in ALS is so exciting to me. And I know we're going to make progress, and it's going to be accelerated. And it's going to be accelerated because of the knowledge we're gaining from understanding the genetic defects and their influence on motor neuron biology, and having better tools to study sporadic ALS and ways to do trials more efficiently. And, but I wanted to stress that. And now to go into some of the specific treatments that we've developed. We have Nudexta for pseudobulbar affect, and there's some implication that this combination drug of cough medicine, dextromethorphan and quinidine in low dose, which is a heart medicine, that this can alter also bulbar dysfunction. We don't yet know that for certain, but there was a small phase 2 trial that showed some effect. But it really works like a charm for laughing and crying too easily, that emotional lability. But then we have riluzole and radicava that have really shown that they slow the disease down. And let's talk a little bit about that. Riluzole prolongs survival in ALS. That's been around now, thank God, since 1995. It inhibits the release of glutamate. Remember that excitotoxicity. And there may be some effect on blocking glutamate at the postsynaptic, at the second nerve cell. When you're talking one nerve cell to another, you can block that glutamate at that second nerve cell. It also may work at an excitability level, what we call the sodium channel. And I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but but that's another mechanism that it may work at. And in huge review of all the data, when we do what's called a Cochrane review, where we look at everything that's been published about riluzole, it's clear that 100 milligrams daily provides a benefit, that it increases the probability of survival, and that increases the median survival, not by that 3 months that was originally quoted, but probably more like 12 to 15 months. And it may have a little bit of an effect on bulbar and limb function, but not muscle strength, and it slows the disease down. The expectation, and this is really important, I think, to get across to people who are taking riluzole, I don't expect you to get better, but I expect that in the long run, the disease, your disease will be slowed and you will live longer. And first, there's been some evidence that even in the last clinical stages, that it will prolong survival. So anytime you start it, it may give benefit. Now, Radicava was approved in Japan for ALS before the US. It is a free radical scavenger, meaning it reduces that oxidative stress that we talked about as one of the mechanisms. There was a phase 2 open label 24-week trial where 30 and 60 milligrams of Edaravone was given IV, and it showed that there was decreased oxidative stress on proteins by measuring nitrotyrosine in the spinal fluid. A phase 3 study was then done, and it's given intravenously, 10 days on, 20 days off. They looked at the ALS-FRS, that functional rating score that you hear so much about when you read about clinical trials. And that was the primary endpoint. And it decreased that ALS-FRS score decline over that 6 months. Instead of dropping 6.35 in the untreated folks, remember that the maximum you can drop, it's a 48-point score. That ALS-FRS has 48 points, and they looked at the drop from 48 down, or from the onset of treatment down. And in people who weren't treated, that score dropped by 6.35 points, whereas those people who were treated only dropped 5.7. Improvement, but it didn't reach what we call statistical significance. The folks at MT Pharma went back and they looked at what they called responders, and that's how they defined, because they had to detect a treatment effect in 6 months. They didn't have a long time to do it. They looked and they saw who responded best in that 6-month time period. And they came up with what's called a responder population to look at an early population, an earlier population who had a vital capacity greater than 80% and an onset of disease less than 2 years. And they looked at those folks as responders. And in fact, what they found was that there was a statistically significant improvement with 5 points of drop in the treated folks versus 7.5 over 6 months. That does not mean that only those people with a vital capacity over 80% and an onset less than 2 years will respond. This study was simply designed to detect a difference in a short period of time. Given long enough, other folks could possibly be detected to show improvement in the decline. Now, that's not improvement in disease, it's improvement in it's slowing down the disease decline. So we don't expect to see improvement. And again, I'm just stressing this is an important point that folks have to get. And it doesn't mean that only people who fit this criteria will respond, although certainly based on this drug was approved in the US, and insurers, in order to limit access and limit their need to cover the disease, they would make this they wouldn't pay for the drug unless you met those criteria, but that didn't mean that was the only way it'll work. And the FDA actually approved Radicava or Edaravone for everyone. And so what are the adverse events? Well, you have to be careful if you have a sulfite allergy that can cause an abnormal, allergic response. And those things that happen in more than 10% were contusions and gait disturbances. And you can see here, it's the percent of treated versus untreated. So, there were also placebo or sugar IVs, people who didn't get Radicava in their IV that also had these events. And then less common, but still there, were things like headaches, dermatitis, eczema, respiratory failure, which may simply be disease progression, sugar in the urine, and infections. And so it's unclear how much is Radicava related. It was seen in placebo, but this is something we report as things that can occur with treatment.
Mi nombre es Emilio Ferré, soy el marido de Patricia Estegui y mi esposa tiene ELA diagnosticado desde febrero del año 2013. Tomó Edaravone se lo inyectaron durante 3 años aproximadamente y hace 3 meses aproximadamente se produjo cambios de catéteres, se le produjo una trombosis, lo cual le tuvieron que sacar de ese brazo el catéter, del otro lado ya también se lo habían tenido que sacar, con lo cual es como que estamos esperando a ver si el trombo se le desaparece, está anticoagulada, y estamos esperando para ver si puede continuar con el tratamiento con Edaravone o no. Pero según entendí, lo que vos decías del Edaravone era aconsejable para los 2 primeros años del tratamiento de la enfermedad. ¿Es así?
So, no, I mean, Edaravone, we administer throughout the course of the illness. It slows it down. I certainly would want to continue it if she's been on it, and would think that it would continue to slow the disease down. It's not just for the first 2 years.
Bueno, mi nombre es Silvia Beatriz de González. Yo estoy por mi esposo, Antonio González. Él tiene un proceso de 12 a 13 años de ELA, con lo cual, es decir, logramos mantenerlo, pero está con respirador, con tráquea, con botón gástrico, con sonda vesical, etcétera, etcétera. Como está tan avanzada la enfermedad, yo quisiera saber si la Edaravone tiene algún sentido ahora que se lo dé, porque es como que ¿qué puede él llegar a recuperar? Es decir, porque incluso ahora le ha afectado un poco la parte cognitiva. Hay días que está totalmente lúcido y otros días que, bueno, como tiene el TOBI, que escribe con el TOBI, a veces escribe pavadas, no llega a comprender bien los textos, qué sé yo. Hay días que está lúcido y otros no. Entonces yo quería saber qué efecto puede tener el Edaravone para un paciente de tanto tiempo.
This is a hard question to answer. Certainly, Edaravone slows the disease down. But at this point, your husband has significant involvement. If he has any movement or any function left, it might benefit him to take Edaravone if it wasn't too overwhelming for you to initiate and continue it. It does take a lot of work on the family because he would need to have the IV administered 10 days out of basically every 30. Remember, it's 10 days out of 2 weeks you do IV, and then you're off for 2 weeks, and then you do it again for 10 days out of the next 2-week cycle. And it's not clear if he has any function left to slow down deterioration. If he does, then it might be worth taking it.
Soy Soledad Muñoz. Yo tengo la enfermedad. Estuve hace 4 años. Se me está complicando hablar. Esa pastilla me puede ayudar a mí.
It sounds like you still have some function left, and so Edaravone slows the functional decline in ALS, so that yes, it may help you if it doesn't impact negatively on your quality of life to do the intravenous. But certainly, if you are still, for instance, have some motor function, you're still walking, or you're still using your arms and or your legs, and still talking to some extent, the Edaravone can preserve that for a longer time.
Bueno, mi nombre es Adriana Estañaro. Soy de Buenos Aires y estoy diagnosticada con esclerosis lateral primaria. Hasta ahora solo me prescribieron baclofeno y estoy en 80 miligramos diarios, que es la dosis superior. Pero veo que va avanzando mi afección vulvar y el tema del esfuerzo para el habla. Mi pregunta era si el Edaravone es viable para mi caso.
We don't really know the answer to this. We haven't tested Edaravone in PLS, but it is a motor neuron disease. The problem is we're not yet smart enough to know the relationship between PLS and ALS. Is it simply part of a continuum? If it is, then of course Edaravone might help. In addition, even if it's not on the continuum but shares mechanism, Edaravone might even be more helpful for PLS because it's a slower disease. And if you slow it down even more, that would be a real bonus. So unfortunately, we don't know the answer to this question yet and whether or not it would be suitable. I do know that in my own population, I use Edaravone for people who have a predominantly upper motor neuron variant of ALS, and that would be labeled PLS in some instances. So, you know, I think that the answer is vague and gray zone, but certainly if it doesn't impact on your quality of life and you can get it approved, you may want to see if it slows your disease down. But the answers aren't there, and it hasn't been tested in predominantly upper motor neuron ALS. Similarly, it hasn't been tested in those folks who have what we would call progressive muscular atrophy, where it's a predominantly lower motor neuron variant, where only that nerve cell as it comes out of the spinal cord to the muscle is affected. You know, I wish I could give you more guidance than this, but there you have it. That's what our knowledge base is as it stands.
Bueno, yo hablo por mi marido. Él es Guillermo Sánchez, él está afectado, será 2 años de ELA, casi 2 años. Bueno, él, toda la parte vulvar, lo que él quería saber era cuál sería, digamos, las contraindicaciones digamos, él ya no puede hablar. ¿Cuál sería el contra del Edaravone o digamos, el favor? No sé, me puso acá, ¿qué lo favorecería a él si, digamos, ya no puede hablar? Lo que tiene es mucha saliva, mucho eso, digamos, y le está afectando todo lo que es el tema que no lo puede sostener, digamos, el cuello, que tiene que usar, digamos, un ortopédico. Entonces quería saber si es bueno para él seguir tomando el Edaravone.
Well, the pros are that it may slow down further changes in his disease, and certainly would be reasonable for him to consider. The cons are simply the adverse events that we reviewed earlier, and also the effect that it would have on your lifestyle. Who would have to give the Edaravone? It's intravenous at this point. And how would that impact on your lives, your activities? It does limit on 10 days that you're getting out of every month, the 10 days out of the 4 weeks. It limits what you can do. You're going to have to be giving or administering an IV, or your husband would have to be going out to get an intravenous infusion. And I think that's the main con. And of course, the risks of the Edaravone. And then, if you have an IV, you can get infection and those kinds of things, just the risk of having either an IV or what we call a port, which is a way to give the Edaravone more easily. For the folks that I treat, when they're on Edaravone for a period of time, they're not just getting the first cycle, but they're going to continue with Edaravone. We usually put what's called a port in place so that it can be easily given and they don't have to get stuck all the time for an intravenous. But I hope that answers your question. To continue, we talked about what's available now, which is the intravenous form of Edaravone, but there is an oral formulation, which is a liquid that's being developed and studied. And the testing to date, what's been looked at to date? Well, how does oral versus getting an IV compare when it comes to measuring the levels in the blood, what we call pharmacokinetics or PK? And does it, if I give it orally versus IV, does it stick around as long? So the levels that it reaches and how long it sticks around is called pharmacokinetics. And I've called that PK. That's the sort of, abbreviation for pharmacokinetics. And then if I give it orally versus if I give it in a feeding tube or an NG tube, is it the same? Is it the same pharmacokinetics? Does it get to the same level in the blood? Does it stick around as long? And what's better? Is it better to give it orally in the same frequency like we're doing the IV, 10 days out of 2 weeks and then 2 weeks off, versus giving it daily? And those are the kinds of questions that are being asked about this oral formulation. And so what's been shown so far is that if you give it to healthy volunteers and you compare giving it intravenous versus orally, it shows a similar PK. The same plasma concentrations are reached, and the same kind of time duration, how long it lasts in the blood, is similar. And similarly, when you give it to people with ALS, that PK of oral Edaravone compared to IV was similar to when you gave it to control. So again, oral seems similar to IV in people with ALS. And when you give it in the NG tube or, per peg, per feeding tube, in both controls and ALS, there's a similar pharmacokinetic appearance to oral versus IV. What all of this means is, okay, it looks like the IV, it behaves like IV in terms of how much concentration is found in the blood and how long it lasts. And all of that means that it can be given by PEG or by mouth and behave in the same way when you look at the blood levels as when you give it IV, suggesting that, of course, it's comparable. The adverse events that were recorded with the oral agent have been mostly similar to ALS progression, and the safety results were generally consistent with the safety profiles of the intravenously given drug. And so far, we've looked at an open label, meaning no placebo, no sugar pill, no sugar liquid in this case, in 216 folks. They were given oral Edaravone in the same frequency that the IV is given, so that 10 days out of the first 2 weeks of the cycle, and then every 2 weeks off, and then another cycle of 4 weeks where during the first 2 weeks you get the drug. And they looked at the safety and the adverse events, and the secondary exploratory endpoint was whether or not how the ALS FRS behaved, whether or not there was a slowing of disease and survival. So 185 folks received oral Edaravone, and 160 folks completed that 6 months of therapy. 78.9% had an adverse event with treatment. Most commonly, it was things that were consistent with disease: muscular weakness, falls because of weakness, fatigue, back pain, constipation, and so forth. 21 patients, or 11%, 11.4 to be exact, reported a serious adverse event. And most commonly, these really reflected progression of their disease, dyspnea, which is shortness of breath, and respiratory failure. There were 6 deaths on the study, the 6-month study of oral Edaravone, and 3 were due to respiratory failure. 1 was, which of course could be progression of ALS, 1 due to ALS, 1 felt to be due to pneumonia, and 1 was unfortunately suicide. Only 11 folks, or basically 6%, discontinued the drug, and the reasons were progression of disease, respiratory failure, and weakness. And when they looked at the ALS FRSR decline, that was comparable to the decline that was seen in that study by which we got IV Edaravone approved, the way that the drug worked in the IV, and the decline was similar with the oral. And so that's the results to date. There's now an ongoing phase 3 study, which is looking at daily oral Edaravone versus the cyclical oral Edaravone. So can we get more bang for our buck if we give it every day, is basically what's being looked at.
Mi nombre es Lorena Salgado, soy de Neuquén Capital, y bueno, estoy para poder consultar sobre este Edaravone oral, más que nada. Estoy con mi marido, él es el que tiene ELA, lo diagnosticaron ahora el 5 de noviembre del 2021. Tenía síntomas de mucho antes, en realidad tenía una operación común, por decirlo, y quizás tapó el diagnóstico. Mi consulta es, bueno, tenía varias. Una es, por ejemplo, según el tipo de la perjudicaría tomando el Edaravone, porque, bueno, algo más o menos uno se va informando que hay varios tipos. Él no está avanzado, entonces como que por ahí, no sé si es mejor aplicar el Edaravone cuando alguien está más avanzado o está recién comenzando. Porque mi marido, digamos, como que él todo lo tiene por ahora en las piernas. Entonces, una de las preguntas era si este Edaravone oral en algún momento, ojalá Dios quiera, se dé en Argentina, si mejoraría la parte muscular de las piernas. Eso sería una de las preguntas. Y bueno, la otra que había anotado era qué sucede en el caso de que por ahí hay enfermedades muy parecidas. Bueno, nosotros estamos en ese proceso todavía, ¿no? De tener la esperanza que sea algo similar, pero en el caso de que de cualquier paciente que ha sucedido, que no lo tiene, puede producirle algo al organismo, digamos, el prescribirle tanto el Riluzol como el Edaravone.
This is a great question, Lorena. First of all, the sooner the better, since the drugs we have, like Riluzole and Edaravone, slow the disease down. They don't reverse it. They slow it down. It makes sense that the earlier we start, the better. And so starting as early as possible is what we actually aim for. At least that's how I look at it in the people that I help. And oral Edaravone or IV Edaravone won't improve function. It slows it down. So getting it on board, like I said earlier, is better than later, but not to expect improvement, but just know that in the long run, it's going to slow the disease down. And for my own folks, as we're trying to confirm a diagnosis, I always offer them Riluzole as it's a pill form. And certainly Edaravone won't be harmful, but it does mean, the IVs, and it's a little more impactful on your quality of life. So that's a decision you have to make if you want to move forward with Edaravone during this diagnostic period. It really depends on how sure your clinicians are, your doctors are about the diagnosis. If Edaravone becomes approved for an oral version, again, the side effects are so few. I think that, yeah, that would also be worth starting earlier. Now that it's IV and that's what you can access, you might want to think twice, but only because of the impact on your quality of life.
Hola, hablo yo, soy Raúl, soy el marido de Silvia. La pregunta es, el Edaravone, ¿cuánto tiempo estiman que va a estar habilitado para tomarlo oralmente? Esa es la pregunta. O sea, el periodo de prueba, ¿cuánto tiempo lleva y cuál estiman que es la mejora que puede dar? Silvia está medicada desde marzo del año pasado. Ella habla, se moviliza, perdió parte de la movilización, o sea, ella habla despacito, pero habla, se entiende, razona perfectamente. O sea, el problema de ella es que le cuesta hablar y poco a poco va perdiendo un poco de movilidad. Así que por eso queríamos saber el oral, cuándo estaría habilitado para tomarlo y cuál es el avance que hay acá en Argentina para probarlo de esa forma.
So we don't know how long it's going to take for the oral form of Edaravone to be approved. We know that in the US, we will be hearing very shortly, within a month or so, whether or not oral Edaravone is going to be approved based on the studies to date, those studies that I talked about, where we showed that it reached the same levels in the blood, it lasted as long, it seemed to have the same effect on the drop in ALS-FRS score as the IV. So once it's approved in the US, then of course it's going to have to be approved in Argentina as well. And I'm not sure that's going to be an automatic approval. And the second question, or part of the question, is what would be the benefit? Well, the benefit is it's a lot less impactful on your life, right? If you can take a liquid. And then the parallel to that is, if it's approved, when will it be approved to take it daily? And will daily be better than this cyclical, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, if you want to make it an easy way to express the cyclic nature of the administration that we have now. The way we give it now is, 10 days out of 2 weeks and then 2 weeks off. My sense is that if that works, every day may work even better, but we won't know that answer for a while yet. And I don't know when that would be approved, because, the cost of daily is obviously going to be more than the cost of 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And so the benefit is going to be of the oral form is going to be, it's going to be easier to administer, and the side effects look similar, and the blood levels look similar, the effects look similar. So it seems to me a no-brainer that the IV is probably going to disappear, but that's my own personal bias that everybody's going to be moved to oral if they can get it. But then the next big question is, will everyday oral be even better than the 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off? And we don't know that answer yet. And we'll see. So I'd like to talk a little bit about assistive technology, and specifically, we'll get to brain-computer interfaces, or BCI. But I think it's really important to read this quote by Steve Gleason, who's been living with ALS since 2011. And he's very famously underscored the importance of assistive technology, and reflects my own feeling. Until we have a cure, until we can stop this disease, leveraging technology is going to be the cure. When a person is diagnosed with ALS, they're expected to fade away and quietly die. This is not okay. The average life expectancy is 2 to 5 years after diagnosis. Along with thousands of others, I am determined not to fade away quietly. By communicating with other patients, it became clear to me that with a sense of purpose, the right support, and the right technology, it is possible to continue to live a meaningful life despite ALS. And I couldn't believe this anymore. But the challenge that we have with assistive technology, with leveraging what we have in the here and now, is that ALS rapidly changes, and that we need to have flexible technologies that can meet the needs. And this just depicts one of my own patients who, over the course of 1 year, went from being able to walk to being on a ventilator. And our focus has been mobility, keeping people active and moving around, communication, which is so critical to all that's human, right? Being able to talk in real time to others, and being able to access our environment and access control. And so the focus of assistive technology for mobility has been ambulatory aids, canes, crutches, walkers. These are all assistive technology. And then moving into power wheelchairs. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our dream that we'll be able to control power wheelchairs independently using brain-computer interface technology. And finally, being able to transfer communication in the here and now, smartphones, tablets, text to speech, texting, computer accessibility. And then, of course, the AAC devices, speech generating devices that can be controlled by typing, but also by eye gaze. And that's the classic Mytobi and speech generating devices. And there are alternative ways to control your AAC. There's eye gaze, there's mouse, where you can use a mouse if you still have hand control. If you have head control, you can use a head mouse. And if you don't have that, you can use eye gaze. But of course, we all know that eye gaze can be quite fatiguing, and it really relies on head control, being able to look at that eye gaze device, as you can see here in the third frame, being able to actually see and keep our head up and control. And so this can be exhausting. In addition, just having access to the computer, there's some built-in access in our operating systems. There's a virtual keyboard. You can have a virtual mouse in your computer to enable you to continue to access it. And then there's these switches like the head mouse. And if you can still talk, there's voice activation. And this is great if you still have some function, but what happens when you don't have function? And that's where brain-computer interface can be developed and is being developed, as I'll point out. And here you can see, these at the present time, these tend to be very elaborate systems with, this is an EEG-based system, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and a computer, and you need people who know what they're doing. It sometimes takes two computers. Here you can see another fellow who's vented, has their EEG-based communication, and then over here is his computer screen that he's looking at with letters, and all of these are, take some technical expertise to support. And so what is a BCI system? Well, it's a system where the user makes choices or selection using brain signals instead of neuromuscular activity or eye gaze. And so you have signals that will be collected through electrodes or various sensors, and we'll talk about the different sensors. They're acquired and processed, and what we call extracted features are taken out of them that determine and can be translated using software into a command, a device command to, for instance, choose a letter on a letter board, to run a power wheelchair, or to make a choice in an environmental control system like Alexa or the Google Home. And so you can be translated into device signals. And so it starts with a sensor. And the simplest thing, of course, is EEG sensors. But there are other sensors. The goal of the sensor, and we're going to talk about those other sensors because they're a little bit more involved or complex. The point of the sensor is really to extract a signal, and knowing what signal to record and from where is part of the goals of the development of brain-computer interfaces. And the sensors can be located on the surface, just under the surface, in the brain itself, and even, as I'll show you, in blood vessels in the brain. So these are really all ways to just detect a potential. Then we have a decoder, which takes that brain signal and translates it into the action, whatever action you determine you want, or program it to, choosing a letter for communication, giving a command to a home environmental control to turn on a light, or even in its most elaborate way, doing a power wheelchair. And so this decoder provides an assistive technology that's an adjunct to other modalities. And as I said, you can type, you can do speech, you can run a smart home device or wheelchair. And so, we have lots of different ways. And I just mentioned there are different sensors. There's the superficial EEG, which of course is the easiest. There's underneath the skin and close to the bone, or even under the bone. And then there's in the brain itself or in the blood vessels intravascularly. And in the EEG-based system, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, that we use a potential called the P300. This is an event potential, and it occurs 300 milliseconds after someone looks at what they're interested in. We call that a target. Hence, it's called the P300. And because it occurs 300 milliseconds after a target. And there's software that's been developed that enables you to decode this. There are algorithms. And originally, it started with 64 electrodes. Imagine putting that cap on. There's 64 electrodes that you have to put gel in. It took an hour to put that cap on. We now have reduced it to only 8 electrodes. And I'm going to show you a system we're using where the electrodes are actually dry and you don't even need to gel them. You present targets then, and you could present the targets either in rows or columns on a computer screen. And I'm going to show you that in a moment. And when you saw the target you wanted, suppose you're spelling something, you see the letter that you want, say it's a letter A. Every time you look at that letter, it would show that this potential would pop up, the EEG would sense it, and you would have to do it multiple times so that the EEG potential would get high enough, the amplitude would be large enough so that the electrode could actually sense it, could decode it and say, oh, she's looking at the letter A and that's what she's interested in, and I can detect that and then translate that into putting that letter A on a letter board on the computer. And so we've made some progress in terms of how you present the targets, and also have been able to, instead of having 2 computers and all that stuff, have a laptop computer with a small amplifier and a head cap. And in fact, we've gotten to the point where people with a functional rating score, remember, I told you that rating score is 48 in a normal, fully functional person, even down to less than 5, meaning a highly disabled person on a ventilator could get a 96% accuracy with 12 cycles, 12 times seeing the target that they want. It's been studied in the home environment. So using that P300 with an EEG cap can be used independently. People are working on interfacing that with the Tobii keyboard and working with dry electrodes, not having to put all the gel on. People are also working with other sensors. So this is just an EEG sensor. People are looking at implantable systems where the electrodes are underneath the dura between the covering of the brain and the brain itself. Unfortunately, that means you have to have a craniotomy and you need to put these sensors in. There's 16 channels, and those folks could identify or you can detect a character every 52 seconds, and it can be used at home. Then there's the endovascular, where you see this little stent. It's like a stent. You've heard of stents in people who have heart attacks and they need to get a stent in their heart. Well, you can get a stent in the arteries to your brain or the veins to your brain. And so this is called a stentrode because it's electrodes in a stent. And this shows you the size compared to, these are millimeters, and that is actually placed in the brain, right in the big vein of the brain. Let me go back. Sorry about that. Placed in the brain in this sagittal sinus, and then the person can look at the targets. Here you can see some targets and choose what they want. And so these are all ways that people are trying to get a better sensitivity to detecting the brain impulses. And then there's the system where it's actually implanted, the sensor itself is implanted, this electrode array is implanted in the motor strip of the brain, and people can use imagery. They just think about moving an arm or a leg, and that can provide a signal to the detectors. Here you can see the detector to drive that algorithm to say, oh, the person was looking at this target at the time the brain wave was detected, and translate that into an action. And that's what BrainGate does. And people have heard about BrainGate. That's actually a sensor that's implanted in the brain itself to detect. And so we wanted to do something a little different. You know, there are a lot of groups working on these very elegant techniques for detection of brain waves that could then be decoded to drive a function. But what do we have now? Okay, these are still years away from being available. These are going to be very costly systems. In fact, we worked with that EEG-based system, and it really was $25,000 or more to have the two computers, the amplifier, the EEG electrode system that was that cap. We wanted to look at what's available now. We know that there are head caps, there's emotives, there's all these head caps available. We wanted to design a brain-computer interface that was portable, practical, and cost effective, using components that are available in the here and now. And that's been the goal of our research of late. And so we know that there's an EEG headset. It's called the Unicorn. I can buy that online for $1,200. And my thought was, rather than a computer screen, how about we use an AR headset that no matter where my head is, those glasses are on my head, and I project my targets, what I want to do, on the AR screen, and I use a single easy laptop or single board computer to project the targets and record from the EEG, you know, decode those signals that I'm getting easily. And in fact, we managed to do that and run an Alexa. But the challenges that we had was, you know, it turned out that those AR headsets that I could buy were physically large, clunky. They weigh 2 pounds, which can be really heavy, I know, for somebody with poor head control and neck weakness. The AR headset itself was like $1,200. And again, maybe we could get something cheaper. They were designed for gaming, right? That's what, yeah, the kids like these things for gaming. And so that they required powerful graphics and really advanced computing, and maybe were more than we needed. So we came up with a simplification where we still used our Unicorn headset. We decided on using a single board computer to both present our targets as well as record the potentials and analyze them and decode them into an action. And we decided to try to do dollar store glasses with a cheap LCD screen. And let's see. And this shows you, here's our Unicorn headset, $1,200, dollar store glasses, a $10 LCD screen that we put together. And we used a Raspberry Pi with a power supply. Together, they're about $110. And so here we have a system that's well under $2,000. And we now developed a prototype that we can use. And I'm going to just show you that prototype just so you can get an idea of what we're working on and hope to have working. And this shows you one of our students, and you can see that Unicorn headset, which is $1,200, an LCD screen, which was $10, dollar store glasses that we've done, the Raspberry Pi, and the battery pack. And this is what the targets can look like. And we can make this fancy. We can program it to show icons, those pictures. You can then choose what you want. This shows you that we can acquire signals, process them into a command. It's about 80% accurate as it stands now. And here somebody's selected, turn the TV on. And we're now working to try to get this more elaborate. We're building our own 3D glasses so that with a built-in LCD screen. And we're also trying to develop a system that would run a power wheelchair. And these are off the shelf. This is things I can buy now, put together and fashion together for folks to use while we're waiting for our more elaborate systems to get built. And so that's the tack we've taken, and we're trying to beta test in our pals here at my center. And, hopefully we'll be able to make a difference leveraging technology, because I think that really the time is now. And if I had the right, what I really want to see is that the engineers, the software engineers, the computing engineers, the AI engineers who really have the skill sets, and if they just spent a few weeks applying them, we could do this now. It can be done now because the technology is out there. And so I work with an engineering school, and our hope is that we can do this in the here and now. And so our future revisions are, we want to be able to turn this system on and off independently of a caregiver. And so we're using a muscle switch called the Python switch to get that. We want a longer battery life. That's why we have that battery pack. We want it to be fully interactable with home devices, Google and Alexa. And we want to use it to drive the power wheelchair. And we're exploring different ways to put that screen in front of your eyes, basically. And so hopefully the next time I talk to you, we'll have beta tested systems, and we'll be putting them in people's homes. And that's going to mean developing a technology support group that when things go wrong for the caregiver, we can help them solve the problems. And we also want to be able to program the systems, individualize that programming to what functions PALs want to do with the system. What everybody will want to do something different. And so we want to be able to have the flexibility to have a menu of abilities or functions that the system can serve. So we're hoping to be able to provide that. That's my dream, is to bring technology into the home and make it user-friendly for PALs now.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Juan Manuel Sosa. Mi esposa tiene ELA hace aproximadamente 8 años. En esta etapa nos cuesta mucho comunicarnos con ella, y por eso estamos interesados en todo lo que es esta parte de interfaz cerebro-computadora. Ante todo agradecer a la doctora por la investigación que está haciendo. La verdad que es muy difícil encontrar a alguien que esté desarrollando algo en este sentido. Y la pregunta es si existen equipos como el Emotip que sirven para jugar y leen los impulsos cerebrales. ¿Por qué no se puede utilizar esos mismos equipos para una comunicación? Sé que lo ideal es una comunicación fluida, pero en la instancia en que nos encontramos nosotros, un sí y un no parecería que es muy importante, y no tenemos ni siquiera eso. Y después, a través del sí y no, se podría lograr con pictogramas, con otro tipo de comunicación, que es menos invasivo. Y el chip, que es genial porque te puede lograr tener una conversación fluida, o por lo menos el chico pudo decir unas palabras. ¿A qué distancia estamos de eso en Argentina o en el mundo? ¿Cuánto tiempo faltaría para desarrollar?
Juan, I couldn't agree with you more. If tools are available like that for gaming, why aren't they being applied to these problems? And that's the whole reason I'm doing what I'm doing. So I'm trying to do just that, is to take off the shelf, equipment and things that are available, and get the expertise in programming the AI and the algorithms to provide a way to even say yes and no. And there are some systems available for that. But but to actually get some more fluid communication as well. And, you know, I think these are available now. It's simply getting folks who are able to help me program and individualize, and getting the backup technologically in the, you know, so that when we provide these systems to people, that they have backup when they break down. Because, you know, these are sophisticated, and I don't expect caregivers to always be able to troubleshoot. We need a team that can troubleshoot when things go wrong. But you're absolutely right. This is available now. If those folks with skill sets had the desire to make them work for people in their homes, and you know, get them going. And so that's our goal. And I'm hoping that in the next year we have systems that we can put in people's homes, that we can help them with this.
Me interesa saber el estado de desarrollo experimental y qué resultados se han tenido hasta el momento, y esencialmente en qué consiste en términos para los no informáticos la tecnología misma, ¿no?
So, you know, I think we've kind of gone over this, that you know, basically it's a simple system. There's a sensor to sense the brain waves. Then we need to have software that decodes what are these brain waves mean, and what was the person actually trying to communicate, and then translate that into an action, which is turn on a TV or spell a word, whatever the desire is. You're absolutely right. There's research, and then there's application of technology. I think we're ready if we have the people with the right skill sets to apply technologies that are available now to the public. The research is in getting it working better, getting it working faster, and actually being able to detect even the thought of moving a limb. You know, these implantable electrodes, they may actually enable even more. But there's technologies available now that can be applied, and that applied research is what we're trying to do. And what, if anyone listening to this has the skill sets or is a programmer, does AI, please come and join our efforts and help me bring it to folks now, because there's nothing I would like more. You know, as a clinician, I have some knowledge base, but I'm not a programmer, and I don't do artificial intelligence, which is the way to sort of take these signals and understand what the person was trying to get at. To, you know, it's the kind of thing which when you're spelling, you know how you have spellers that then can predict what somebody wants. AI enables us to predict what intent was. And so people who do AI, all of that can be integrated. And there are people with the right skill sets that if they applied it to this problem with the technologies we have now, we would have systems right now that could be used to communicate, to control. And so cross our fingers that people start to come out of the woodwork and help me develop this. Otherwise, I'm limping along the way I am, sort of getting people to help me, but we're getting close. And the research, though, is really coming along a lot and being applied as well in rehab centers, but it's years away from being in the home. And that's the problem. Some of these more sophisticated techniques are not in the home yet. They're starting to get there. But I know that we have technology that we could do now. And that's what I'm passionate about, is leveraging what we have now into the home.
Ese aparato, ¿cuándo va a ser su costo? ¿Cuánto va a costar? Es muy caro.
Well, Soledad, that's exactly right. And that's what one of our goals is, as you saw, it's practical, it's leveraging what we have now and making it cost effective. So we can put together a system for probably under $2,000. The problem is going to be this, and I've thought a lot about this. In order to support the infrastructure necessary to maintain that technical support for people who have the system, it's going to have to cost a little more because you got to pay people who are going to be ready to answer questions and support the systems from afar. And so that might make them cost more like $2,500 or $3,000 because we have to pay people in the background, right? The other thing is integrating it, at least in the US, integrating it with communication software so that you can communicate with it, may have it fall under AAC devices, which are covered by insurers here in the US. You know, I wish I knew more about Argentina and how your insurance system works there and coverage works there. But in the US, if it does communication, we can convince payers to pay for this technology because it will enable communication. So fingers crossed that as we develop this here, that will expand. It's sort of like will be a MyToby that's more, more able to follow people throughout the course of the illness and even at stages where they're vented and unable to move or hold their head up to look at a screen as in a MyToby. So, that's another goal, is to make this cost effective for the average person. We're not all rich. We can't all go out and buy these fancy things. How do we make it cost effective for the average person who's already strapped with all the cost of this disease?
Excellent, Terry. Thank you so much for all this. Do you have any more slides to show?
I have a final comment.
Of course. Go ahead.
So, first, as we conclude, I want to thank everyone for their questions and thank you for the invite. I hope that you can tell how passionate I am about BCI and leveraging technology, but I'm also passionate about all the other areas that we talked about today. So, finding genes that cause disease provides information about the pathways that are important to motor neuron function and that can be targeted for treatments. That's why it's so important to continue our genetic investigations. And this crosses over to sporadic ALS as well. And there are more treatments than ever being tested. And we do have 2 drugs that slow disease down that have been approved in the US and in Argentina. And while we're waiting for cures, though, and drugs that stop the disease, we need to leverage assistive technologies that can provide ways for us to have more independence for people living with ALS and more quality of life and enhance it. And those technologies are available now if we get the right talents to put them together in the right ways. And there are people out there with those talents if we can get them and leverage them. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that this was helpful.
Of course it was, Terry. Thank you so very much. I like the way you organized the presentation. You cover all the pretty wide topics we had for today, and that everything came together pretty nicely. So thank you so much for this contribution. Thank you so much for taking some time from your very busy schedule and talking to our folks in Argentina. Thanks again, Terry.
Thank you.
We will surely be in touch. Again, I'm looking forward to seeing you in person in San Diego by the end of November, probably.
Same here. Take care.
Take care, you too. Thank you so much, Terry.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye bye. Cuídense todos. Los saludo.
Gracias, Pablo, Darío, Seba.
Gracias.
Listo.